You're listening to the Columbia HXA podcast. I'm Clayton Smith.
And I'm Anthony Rispo. Could it be?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, what could it be?
Okay, I think we caught up. Okay. Fuck. Okay. All right. Well, apparently we're having some technical difficulties. Hopefully that delay doesn't come back. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Columbia HXA podcast. I am Clayton Smith. As usual, I'm joined by Anthony Rispo. Say hello, Anthony.
Hello? Well, I can't ask you how you're doing, but you can ask yourself.
I hope you're all doing well. So today is just me and Anthony. No guest this week. Hopefully we're going to have one next week. We have a couple people kind of on the docket. So hopefully we're going to get one of them. But there's some really cool stuff that we want to talk about. And I'll start off with, I think we should start off with something that we went to rather, and that was the recent America debates. This is something that Fire and the Free Press put on together. And it is, as I'm sure you guessed, a series of debates. And this one, the question was, should the U.S. still police the world? And saying yes to that question was Bret Stephens and Jamie Kirchick. And saying no were Matt Taibbi and Lee Fong. So Anthony and I went to that. It was super cool. There was a surprise guest. They had Tim Dillon open, and he just did like a quick 5-minute set, but it was really good. Really funny.
A breath of fresh air, to be honest.
Yeah, it was great. And I don't really want to go into too much detail about it because I think they've just released it, so you can go and listen to it yourself. If they haven't, then they will soon. But I don't want to like spoil it for anyone, basically. But I will say it was like a very, very interesting debate. I thought everyone performed well, and I recommend that you listen to it. What were your thoughts, Anthony? Do you enjoy yourself?
Yeah, I really did, and it got me thinking about the art of rhetoric, and how, it's so easy to make a point that is centered around compassion, around the well-being of others, and we don't want to be the police of the world. We don't want to hurt other people. But when you're put up against people, well, I don't want to spoil it for anyone too, and this is also my view. When you're put up against people who really have their stuff down and their rhetoric down and their arguments down, and it's those kinds of arguments, the dissenting view, tend to sound very weak. In my view, it sounded very weak, the dissenting view against the question. And
you mean to Taibbi and Fong? You thought?
Yeah.
Well, I will say there's something to stage presence too. I think actually Taibbi and Fong, in terms of the facts they brought to bear, were pretty good. But Stephens and Kirchick just had a stage presence that was like, that's the kind of thing that shouldn't matter in a debate, ideally, but obviously it does. We won't spoil like who won the debate, even though in my opinion, who wins these debates is actually less interesting than just if the debate was an interesting one. And I will say the margin of victory, not spoiling who won, was not super huge. I think everyone overall performed well, but Kirchick and Stephens just brought a sort of energy and charm to their performance, I guess, for lack of a better word, on stage than Fong and Taibbi did. But that's not to say that Fong and Taibbi didn't perform well, because they brought up some very, very good points, and certainly weren't bad on stage. But I thought that the motion was really interesting in that I think it's too vague. I voted yes. I was on the yes before and after. Because
likewise.
If you guys aren't familiar with these, everyone in the audience votes either yes or no to the motion, and then at the end of the debate, people vote again, and then we figure out who moved more. So it does not about who, has the majority. It's about who convinces more people, basically. And I voted yes both times. But I feel like a big part of that was the fact that, like, should the U.S. still police the world? I think so, but I also would say we've over-policed the world and we've poorly policed the world in many instances. And so it's not like I'm not a fan of the Iraq War or Vietnam, or, there's plenty of things we've done in terms of funding regimes in like South and Central America that I think was horrible. And and we've mispoliced the world in many instances. But like, should we still have a global presence, have bases in Europe, have bases in Japan, um, enforce a kind of norm, like a global norm in terms of the way things are done? Yes, I just think we've often overextended ourselves and used a ends justify the means logic to global policing, um, that has gotten to us into a lot of trouble. And I'm just noticing my mic might be a little too loud, so I'm turning that down just a bit. But
No, you
it's
sound
gotten
good.
us in,
Yep.
it's gotten us into a little bit of trouble. And so like Taibbi and Fong brought up a lot of good points, um, to that end. They mentioned a lot of the things I have problems with in terms of our foreign policy historically, but then they kind of make they make the leap to, okay, we shouldn't police it all, and we should just work with our partners across the globe and kind of, um, like strike deals and be more pragmatic. And I'm sympathetic to that view, but it just
Yeah.
strikes me that you land in an anarchical, excuse me, an anarchical system, um, that is too unpredictable and too dangerous and creates a power vacuum that I
Well,
would find very disturbing.
yeah, it's also not realistic in terms of the human behavior front. I mean, we
Right.
can idealize, we can imagine a wonderful world where you just back out and you mind your business, you leave everybody to their own affairs, but you have the nefarious actors who
Mhm.
really want to subjugate, to dominate.
Right.
Um, and we see evidence of that. It's so clear, and so one of the things that I discussed with someone a day after the debate, um, was this nuanced approach. And you'd mentioned, I don't want to deviate too much from what you were saying, because this is relevant. It's the question that was a little odd, um, at the debate, because yes, there's nuance there. I mean,
Right.
it's okay. Are we gonna? Well, first of all, let me just backtrack. We have the very odd we have a great advantage in our democracy, but also a disadvantage in terms of foreign policy when it comes to these things, whereby we have the changing of the guard every 4 years, like different
Mhm,
administration
mhm.
coming in and
So it's
going
hard to
out,
be
and
consistent.
it's hard to be consistent. So what is perceived or experienced as us being flimsy and all over the place is really just our system doing its job. But this one person also said, well, what do you want? Do you want to fund a country that is vulnerable? Um, or what about, as opposed to funding, what about your diplomatic efforts? Like, what about if you go in there and actually help them strategize, rather than just giving money, funding, and leaving it there on the table? And it's just there's a lot of nuance there that I think needs to be addressed with a question like that. But fundamentally, I really liked, the argument for the question, because it spoke to my my sort of better understanding of this. There's only one thing I feel black and white about sometimes, and it's this kind of thing. It's that when you're dealing with nefarious actors, there often isn't it's kind of a contradiction, but there often isn't a way to be nuanced, um, in a sense that, you can't always negotiate really well with terrorists,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there is nuance in the fine details as it pertains to protecting the region
Right,
and all
right.
those
Well,
geopolitical things, you know.
and again, it's like kind of the point I was making was the motion, should the US still police the world, is like kind of broad, and it's sort of black and white, and with like by necessity to a certain point, because you have to have something you can debate to have a
Hmm.
debate. Um, but I have a bias towards the middle ground, which is, and you're kind of talking about the same thing, right? Which is like, um, I think we're both talking about the same thing, which is like, okay, if we agree we should police the world, there's a huge range of ways to do that. And like,
Yeah,
how do we fund countries that are vulnerable, or that, we want to get in good with for geopolitical strategic reasons? Or do we provide military
yeah.
backing to the lesser of two evils who still might be kind of bad? Like, there's all of these questions in the yes, in like, it's not like yes we should police the world and no we shouldn't. It's,
Yeah, right, right.
if we say yes, there's like a whole nother, laundry list of arguments to be had as to how we should do that. And so like I would say yes to this motion, yes, we should still police the world, but that would come with a lot of caveats about like, here's why maybe we shouldn't get into another Iraq type situation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
yeah.
also what I will say with the extreme complexity of geopolitics, it's like we don't know the alternative of a world where we don't invade Iraq. And I'm
Yeah.
generally against the Iraq war. I do like think it was a disaster for a whole nother number of reasons. But also like there's like that, there's like that butterfly effect. It's like if you could go back in time and you change the trajectory of a butterfly's path or something, or a single flight flap of a butterfly's wing can alter
Hmm.
the course of, it's like if we go back in human history just like a few years, right, and like convince the Bush administration not to invade Iraq, right? Who knows? We might live in a world where Saddam Hussein ends up getting mass weapons of mass destruction, or gets into a war with Iran that
Oh yeah, yeah.
goes, like we actually
Well,
don't
there's
know the alternative. And so we might actually be living in the better alternative world, even though Iraq was still a disaster. Do you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
there's so
yeah.
many variables that you can't account for that you can never know how they would have played out. So having humility when we talk about geopolitics is important, at least a little bit of it. But anyway, enough about our
Yeah,
takes on it.
the only other thing I wanted to say is it's sort of like a duh because the free press is amazing, but it's likely there's going to be a selection bias. There's going to be people who are probably going to going to be on the yes side of that question. So when I was like at the beginning of this podcast, it was like these two guys are great rhetoricians and they still,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna. That's actually I'm not giving anything away. So, but that's my own bias because I mean the crowd is
Oh, the crowd
very
was crazy biased towards,
sympathetic. Yeah.
yeah,
So we got to also
Stevens
think
and
about the
Kershake. Yeah.
crowd. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Nonetheless, it was a great experience. Thank you for asking me to go. That was
Oh yeah,
great.
yeah. I
Yeah.
had an extra ticket, and I like basically was like, Anthony, you want to go to this with me, because the other person I was gonna go with backed out, and last minute. And
Yeah.
not only did you end up going to the show, but then we also ended up getting into the after party,
And we
which
were so underdressed. It was so
I
funny.
was so underdressed. I
I
was
was in
wearing
like my Midwesterners, but like I was like this like felt like a closeted Midwestern
yeah,
prepubescent
I was in like
moviegoer with these like
jeans,
weird Skechers
sneakers,
I
and
had
a
on.
sweatshirt. It was terrible. But we had a really good time. We both briefly met Barry Weiss, who was very sweet.
Oh,
Uh,
she's so sweet. She's a wonderful
she
person.
just seems so lovely
Yeah.
in person, which was great. And also, I got a hug from Nellie Bowles, because on my way
Yeah.
out, I saw her and I just leaned over and said, "I just want to let you know I adored your book." And she was like, "Oh my God, thank you," and gave me a big hug. Um, and so that was cool. And I talked with Yuri Berliner for like a couple minutes, and he was very sweet. And maybe this is a story for another time, but I'm now having a meeting with someone about a career in like audio journalism, because I mentioned that to him briefly, and he was like, "Oh, give me your phone number. Let me hook you up with someone who's really great." So he was, I maybe a little drunk, but very nice. I have to assume he was being, I don't know. No, but he was really cool.
He's been
So
he's
yeah,
been to the rodeo many times, so
yeah.
probably meant it. I'm pretty sure he
Oh,
did.
I'm sure he
Mm.
seemed very, very nice. I mean, none of
Yeah.
these people we talked to for very long. I very briefly spoke with Jesse Single, who I'm a big fan of, which was cool. And um, I think you spoke to him as well, very briefly. And no one, I don't think we got to talk to anyone super for a super long time, but we got to meet a lot of cool people, which was a lot of fun. And the drinks were free, which was great. Uh, Even though I didn't end up drinking anything, it would have been nice to have
Yeah.
a free beer. That's
I just had water,
yeah,
right?
I did too. Oh, and
Yeah.
I got a free hat. Now look at that. So that was
It's a
a lot
nice
of
hat.
fun,
Yeah.
and definitely check out that debate when they post it, if they haven't already. If they have, we'll include it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But what's next on the docket
Want
here?
to talk about Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to admit, look, I I haven't read his work. Um, I would like to read his latest book, but I think I should invest some time in his other work. I mean, what would you say, Clay? Have you
Yeah.
read?
The problem with me and reading Coates is, so everyone that I've heard talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about, whether or not they agree or disagree with him, the fact that he is a phenomenal writer.
Yeah, a great
He's
writer. Yeah,
apparently
that's
just
what
an
I've heard
absolute
too.
artist with a turn of phrase.
Actually,
Um,
Coleman Hughes explained him, described him as a composer of
right.
words. I'm
Um,
paraphrasing that, but yeah.
so
Well, he did say
let's go
composer.
through
Yeah.
the rest of this, even though, and the problem with me and reading Coates is like, I would like to read his work because I think it would be good to get his perspective, and I really plan on doing it at some point. But you and I are both in college, and I have so much to
Um,
read for class. And on top of
Forget
that, and we're
it.
going to talk about this later, I absolutely have to get through Musa Al-Gharbi's new book, We Have Never Been Woke.
Same. Yep, yep.
And on top of that, I really want to get through Rob Henderson's memoir, Troubled. I've been meaning to read. That's been on my read. So I have like all these books I really want to read that I know I will enjoy. Whereas like reading Coates, despite his skill, I'm assuming will be a chore for me because I will find
You'll need
many of his viewpoints like obnoxious,
you need blood
which is
pressure
not an excuse.
medication.
Like you should read people who you disagree with. But
Yeah,
I just am like maxed out on my reading list right
I
now.
am too. I am too.
So we'll go through the rest of this, assuming that his skill as a writer is not overstated and he really is very good. Um, which I'm almost certain is true. I'm about as certain is true without having actually read him as I can be, because so many people whose opinions I trust have said as much. Um, so including like Coleman and Glenn Lowry and I think John McWhorter said as much as
Hmm.
well too. So I think that's
Well, his
pretty ridiculous.
ideological orientation is pretty obvious to me. I think to us, to anybody really. Um, and so just his premises, just his logic around various social issues, is enough for me to at least dip my feet in
Right.
to criticize. I mean, I would definitely wait
Well,
and not say anything about the book itself, but the general sense of what he's going for is pretty common right now. So
yeah, and I think I mentioned this in last week's episode, but we think we talked about it. Coleman Hughes released a review of his new
yes.
book, which is called The Message,
Hmm.
which is pretty scathing.
Yes.
And again, Coleman Hughes being someone whose opinion I far more often than not agree with and greatly value. So, um, with like, I don't want to endorse that review of the book without having actually read the book, but I
Appeal
will
to
say like it's
authority.
worth reading because I think
Yeah.
he's not the only one who is criticizing him in the ways he is.
Right.
Um, and a lot of that criticism is coming from his treatment of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and
On the
basically
last essay. Yeah.
right. And he covers several different things in the book. The largest section and I believe the last section is his take on Israel Palestine, which is, from what I can understand, almost entirely informed by a 10-day trip to the West Bank that he
Yes.
recently took, which is not enough. That's definitely not enough to to comment on that. Like, I have done my best to educate myself on this, probably more than him, it would seem like, with the obvious, asterisks that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I have not actually been to Israel or Palestine or anything like that. But
Right.
and I would not even begin to talk about this with any sort of certainty, right? Like, I'm happy to talk about it. I have my opinions on it, but they're not like concretely held
I
opinions.
agree. I mean, I
Um,
feel very much so the same about that. There are general things that I firmly understand, and there are key
mhm,
things that I don't. And again, like just
there's
echoing
a
what you
lot.
said about just being extremely bogged down by schoolwork, and yeah.
Mhm.
And I know that
But
sounds like an annoying excuse to some
we
folks, some listeners, but it's the truth.
we don't have to be experts on Coates overall to talk about the main thing I want to talk about in this,
Yeah.
because like I said, Coleman came out with a review. We're gonna put it in the show notes. Read it. It's very interesting. It was for the Free
Yeah.
Press.
Yeah.
Um, because there was just one little interesting thing that I noticed on Twitter that I wanted to bring up, or I guess X. And that was the kind of heat he's getting for his interview that he did with Trevor Noah, who has a podcast. I can't remember the name of Trevor Noah's. Is it Conversations Without Limits or something like
I'm
that? Anyway, Trevor Noah has a podcast. He
not
went on the
sure.
podcast. Coates did, and he makes this point that like I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but this is pretty much it. If I were born in Gaza and Gaza's, but he makes the point that Gaza's like this open air prison, like everyone says. Um, and my dad's a fisherman and he can't go too far out or he'll face trouble from the IDF, or my mom can't get too close to the wall or she might get shot, or my sister gets cancer. She has to hopefully get the permits to go into Israel, or she might not be able to get the treatment she needs. Um, and if that wall, that
Yeah.
fence comes down on October 7th, am I strong enough to resist going in through the breach and, committing all sorts of crimes and atrocities? And he says, I don't know if I am. And so naturally, he's getting a lot of heat on X, people saying, oh, Coates is revealing himself here. He's just bloodthirsty and anti-Semitic. Or, if I were in that situation, I would simply not rape and murder anyone. And all of
Well,
these like digs at
it's
him, right?
it's hindsight bias. I mean,
Right.
he's not there. He didn't experience it. He's applying his current sensibilities to a situation that he didn't experience,
Mm-hmm.
and it just
Well,
on its face, it's an argument. Like I said, it could be a good argument structured with good premises, and the conclusion. It can all be a pretty good argument, but it doesn't make it a true argument. It doesn't. If you don't have um any substance to the argument, then it's a false claim. I mean, you
Well,
can't
no,
say,
no, no. Hold on. I disagree with that. I'm actually going to kind of
yeah,
defend Coates, and I'm also going to point. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to sort of defend Coates on this point
uh-huh,
to a degree because I think people are being unfair, and I'm also going to talk about a tweet that Chloe Valdery, who some of you
uh-huh.
might be familiar with, who's also at the Free Press after party, but I didn't get a chance to speak to her. I think she's quite proven herself to be quite wise, at least on Twitter, and when I've seen her, listen to her in podcasts and whatnot. So I like
Hmm.
her.
Right.
Because she tweeted something that I think is quite poignant that I responded to on Twitter actually. But um, I'm going to defend Coates and say this,
Okay.
and I will say one, and I'm going to criticize him in a very different way, slightly. Um, I think he's right, and I think that is true of you. I think that's true of me. I think that's true of everyone. What he is
Oh, I
doing is
see where you're going
actually
with that. I see where you're
quite,
going. Yeah.
I think, obvious, which is I'm very much a subscriber to this idea, and I think Sam Harris also talks about this a lot, which is this sort of idea of like moral luck, right? Like we don't choose into what circumstances we are born. We don't even choose the, genetic biological predispositions that we have in terms of our personality, right? So I'm not a
Hmm.
believer in like true libertarian free will. I think it's an illusion, as Harris often points out. So through that lens, what Coach is saying is very obviously true. Like if I was born as a Palestinian in Gaza, I don't know what kind of person I would be. I don't know how I'd react to October 7th. There are plenty of people in Gaza, it needs to be said, that are not rapists and murderers who did not participate and who were horrified by what happened, right? But if you're born into that, there's no guarantee you end up as that person. I mean, there are people who are born into the relative comfort and luxury of the United States who end up being rapists and murderers and serial killers, either because they're born with some horrible mental illness like Jeffrey Dahmer, or they're, abused as a kid and that messes them. You know what I mean? Like the accidents of birth matter. And so these people saying, I would simply have not killed anyone. It's like, well, you actually didn't grow up in Gaza. You don't know how you'd react to
Well, that
it.
would also be hindsight, but you can't.
Right.
They're both not good art. They're both valid arguments, but
Right.
they're not sound arguments. They're
And
not. They're false in that I like. I'm not. I just a quick like just interruption and to go with on what you're saying. I think, are you saying that just by virtue of being a human being, we don't know what the conditions that are going to be that are thrown our way and how we're going to respond as a
right.
result? Like we
Like
actually,
I know and to get a little nuance with it, like I know the current version of me, if you like
yeah.
plopped me down in Gaza and I had to live there for a few years and the walls came down, I still would not do that, right? But I don't think that's the point that Coates is making. I don't think he's saying that if you put him there now, he would do it. I think he's saying, from what I can tell from the video, like if he had grown up there and he'd experienced that from childhood, like and that's a crapshoot for any of us. So I don't think he's wrong to bring that up. And insofar as he's making this point to garner some sympathy, some empathy for people, I actually think that's a good thing to do. I think we need to take pause and realize. I think we should do this with everyone who does bad things. Is just remind ourselves like we are in a sense lucky to have been born in different circumstances where we didn't end up as a murderer, a rapist, a con man, right? Um, and again, this is like logic that you hear Sam Harris talk about a lot. Someone who would be diametrically opposed to Coates. So that's kind of why I'm bringing it up, right? Is like this is something we should all reasonably be able to agree on. Um, Now, what I will say is that is not an excuse for immoral action. So if you're making that point to say, therefore, we should have some amount of humility and empathy regarding these situations, I agree. But if you're using it to say, therefore, we should maybe cut them some slack, not
I
really.
see.
You know
Okay,
what I
so you're
mean?
all right. So it's a nuanced argument you're making, and I agree with it. I think that so the first point of conditionality, like you don't have control over your environment, you don't know how you're going to respond. The
Mhm.
conditions even probably in many cases will prompt you to respond in necessary ways in in a given moment for survival. But what underlies now going to the second part of it, what underlies so much of his thought process, and this I know I can say fairly confidently because it's a through line in his work, is the post-colonial through line.
Oh yeah.
It's that it's the simplistic idea that Western is oppressive and everyone else is subjugated by the West equals bad. I mean, equals oppressed. So it's
Mhm.
like it gives credence to it gives it this argument that he's making sounds embroidered. It's embroidered in empathy and maybe even by saying that it makes him in a bad it makes it sound like I'm making him into a bad actor. I don't think that maybe he's not a bad actor, but it it gives credence to so much of what is we're seeing right now on college campuses and even outside college campuses.
Yeah.
This anti-West um, sentiment, this anti-West, tear down the system. The West is the oppressor. The
Right.
Palestinians are
And
brown, so they're oppressed. It's literally that reductive. And
yes.
so what worries me is that this is yet another book by um, another writer who is an intellect. I believe he is quite intellectual, as opposed to a few of the others who come along. um, but who is going to permeate the social scene again and give weight to
Mhm.
these ideas and here I go. I don't want to sound like oh, we shouldn't platform it. That's not where I'm coming from. I'm just saying, well, what we're doing now, we have to criticize it because this is a false argument that Israel is the oppressor and that
Well,
to
slow
somehow,
slow down. Slow down. Um, that's
well,
not a
why?
totally false argument. It's not that the Palestinians don't face, a bad situation, and I
That's
think in
different from
many ways you could argue Israel is oppressive.
they're not, but that's
Um,
different from being called an oppressor from the lens of
right.
from this
I
post-colonial
see what you're
lens.
saying. I'm just saying it's
Yeah.
nuanced, and what Coates is guilty of is not applying a nuanced, even-handed lens to this conflict because he did not clearly it seems he did not study it for long enough. And B, there's
Yeah.
another thing. He was very recently talking to Ezra Klein on his podcast, and Klein asked him, "Did you like talk to anyone or walk with anyone who like basically is on the other side of this issue to get a varied perspective?" And Coach just replies, "No." And he says something like, "Oh, I there's some things for which I don't want to hear the excuse." And that is the kind of closed-mindedness.
So
And
then, Clay, let me ask you: do you think that rational that having a discussion with someone like that, a nuanced discussion, is going to work? Because
yeah,
you do you
yeah.
think
So I
with
there's
him?
well, yeah, I think if you could get him on a podcast where someone is pushing, and he was pushed in that CBS
Okay.
interview recently, and in my opinion, didn't actually give a very good answer. I think some people thought that he did. I think, and even in this interview with Trevor Noah, maybe he talks about how like, oh, how'd you come up with this no, maybe it was Mehdi Hassan. Mehdi Hassan was talking to him and was kind of saying, "Oh, how did you have such a good answer on the fly?" And I remember thinking, "Well, his response wasn't that good. He kind of dodged. You couldn't get away from the fact that he didn't actually do a good job of representing the conflict." But um, do I think it's worth talking to someone like him? Yeah, because one of two things happens: either by some miracle you get to him to open his mind a little bit, or you make him look foolish for the error he is making, which is being closed-minded,
Yeah,
like intentionally closed-minded. And both
I
of those serve to kind of either expose this kind of foolishness for other people, or maybe provide an example of a better way to think about things.
no, yes, I agree that exercise that exactly what we aim to do to have open discussions. Um, I I mean that exercise. I believe that would I believe that could potentially elicit an outcome, as you're saying, but it's just this way of thinking, this post-colonial, post-modern, even
Hmm.
just this very black and white way of thinking that they have these flowery ways of basically making one point, and that is Israel is the oppressor because it's from the West. It's a Western democracy model, and everyone else around them they're oppressed, and
Hmm.
it's literally that. Like I said,
Yeah.
reductive. So I mean, how do
It's
you?
the problem is it's reductive. It's not that
Yeah.
oppression it doesn't come into play for the
But see,
Palestinians.
they don't think about it like that.
Right,
That's what I'm
right. But I'm
saying.
just
They
saying,
don't
like,
think about it like that. They think,
we are agreeing that it needs to
you
be
know,
nuanced. But really quickly, I do
yeah,
want to get kind of take us back a little bit because I said I wanted to talk about
sure,
this
yeah.
thing specifically, and
The tweet,
yeah, the tweet, and
yeah,
so kind of continuing on with the point I was making earlier, which is okay. So he makes this good point. People, I think, are criticizing him unfairly. The actual good criticism of this point, I think, and I will just re-emphasize like this is a good point to make if the only point you're making is to have empathy and humility. I totally agree with it. But if it is to somehow act as any kind of justification or do anything more than that, right? Chloe Valdery tweets this really good thing. And what she says in the tweet is, um, so Ta-Nehisi Coates suggests that he like would have maybe taken part in October 7th if he had grown up in Gaza. She responds with this. Then you would also be a Jewish extremist in the West Bank. How do you like them apples? And I loved this because she's so right. And I responded to this tweet and I'll read my response. I responded exactly. The problem with this line of argument is that it's pretty much true for everyone with everything. Circumstances can explain behavior and should often elicit empathy, but they don't justify immoral actions. And so this is the point she's making is like, okay, yes, you might have acted that way if you had grown up in Gaza, but you also would have been the Jewish extremist who's encroaching upon territory in the West Bank if you had been born in a different set of circumstances, right? So
yeah,
it's kind of a non-point aside from the empathy that I mentioned earlier. It kind of means nothing. Okay, it's like there's this other old clip of this like British morning show that I love,
mhm.
where this Italian guy is responds to this woman in this really funny way. I forget the details, but basically he says, "If my grandmother had wheels, she would have been a bike." You know what I mean? So it's like,
That's funny.
it's like, yes, if you would have been born in Gaza, you would have participated perhaps in October 7th. But to Chloe's point, if you had been born in the West Bank, you would have been maybe or if you would have been born in Israel, you might have ended up as a Jewish extremist. If you were born in early 20th century China, you might have participated in the Cultural Revolution. If you had been born in 1920s Germany, you might have grown up and gone to Hitler Youth and maybe participated in World War II or something as a Nazi, right? Like this is such a broad and obvious point that it almost means nothing.
Yeah. The other part of it though is, I mean, what if he does believe, like many potentially believe, that maintaining this idea that Israel is the oppressor is the empathetic point? What if this, let's take him out of it because I don't want to assert anything on his end, but what if we're saying, okay, may you make this statement, if you have empathy, and in which you really are trying to say is there are people here in this region who are suffering, um, and if I were there, I mean, who knows what I would do? My goodness, if I were suffering like that, I might become violent, or I might do this. I might do any by any means necessary, right? I mean, as we've heard
Mhm.
that quote, and we'll get to that in a second. There's a certain desperation there that you can see in another person, and you can say, okay, I think I get what you're saying because you're in such desperation, and okay, so you can have that empathy, that cognitive empathy, but also, what if he or others feel exactly like I'm trying to say, that, well, Israel and the West are oppressive and they're oppressors, and they maintain within in their thought process that this is actually the empathetic way to think, that we need to save these oppressed people. You know what I'm saying? It's we're presupposing that their intention for empathy depends on just one condition, like I feel badly for these people, I feel something for these people who are suffering, rather than this other perspective that's pervasive, that's saying these are the oppressed oppressed people and these are the oppressors.
Hmm.
And I believe that a lot of the students on campus actually I would be I think it would not be correct to say, and I'm actually correcting myself from months of thinking this way, that it would be wrong to say that some of those students, a lot of those students don't have empathy. It would be wrong to say that they don't care about what's going on,
Yeah.
even though I believe that they don't know what's going on. But it doesn't mean that it's their empathy vacant. It just it's just they believe that their empathy is um it's signaling to them and reinforcing to them that they're right, they're virtuous, they're moral. And it is true for them. It's viscerally true that Israel is the oppressor.
Hmm.
And and so just to end there, that claim is false. That Israel is the oppressor is a false claim because the way why it's false is because the lens through which they're experiencing Israel as the oppressor is from a model. It's a reductive binary model put together by post-colonialists who use Freudian psychodynamics or psychoanalysis that basically says, imbued on your personhood is the mark of oppression because these people oppressed you. And so, but through the ages, you will forever have this mark of oppression.
Hmm.
That's how they view it. It's not, it doesn't exist within the realm of reality. That's what
Well,
I'm,
I agree with you. It is false in the binary sense,
yeah.
but I think a better way to put it is Israel, in a sense, is it depends on how you define oppressive, and this is why nuance is so important. But like, okay, so here's a better way. Like, people describe Gaza as an open air prison, and they're kind of right. But the problem is they stop there and they
Yeah.
say, okay, Gaza is an open air prison. Therefore, Israel is some horrible, oppressive force that is just horrible, like just awful and evil, right?
Hmm.
Well, okay, yeah, I agree with you that it sucks for people in Gaza and that ideally they would not be in that situation. And it does break my heart. All of the things that like Coates describes in this clip about, his hypothetical alternate father not being able to go out too far when he fishes, or his mother have to avoid going too close to the wall, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
But then people don't realize, like, okay, but like, why is that situation the way it is? Well,
Yeah.
it is shitty for Gazans. It is unfortunate. Israel, certainly there are people in the IDF who are guilty of being horrible to
Yeah.
Palestinians. And there is a
Sure.
problem with right-wing extremism in Israel. There is certainly a problem with anti-Arab, anti-Muslim bigotry in Israel. Undoubtedly.
Yeah, Israel was
Undoubtedly,
having
it is real,
problems before October
right?
7th.
All of that's,
Yeah.
but
Hmm.
I wonder if they're in that open air prison, quote unquote, situation because Iran is trying to ship in all kinds of weapons to a terror organization that wants to commit a genocide against the Israelis.
That yeah, that's
And like the same organization that walked into Israel stormed into Israel on October 7th of last year and butchered over 1,000 people and took hundreds of them hostage. Like, yeah, they're not. It's not an open air prison just because the Israelis want to like fuck over, excuse my French, the Palestinians. They're trying to prevent arms from being transferred into Gaza. They're trying to prevent the Hamas terrorists and other terrorist groups like Islamic Jihad has a presence there, from just like walking right into Israel proper and committing October 7th again and again and again. Like they leave out that nuance. So like
but
yes, in a
that's
sense, Israel is being oppressive to the Gazan people, to the Palestinians of Gaza. But it's like kind of justifiable, at least in theory. And I'm not saying I agree with everything they do in regard to that situation. I'm not saying that people don't act in ways that are horrible against the Palestinians that are not defensible. But it's just that it's more nuanced than that.
well, it's more nuanced than that. And then we don't have to get into the weeds with this right now, but just as something that I think crowns it is the Islamic Republic. If you really want to talk about the broader picture and the real rot here is the Islamic Republic. And
Yeah.
it's you have a bunch of people, and that puts it very lightly, um, in the surrounding Arab countries, Arab states that want that regime gone.
Yeah.
And I mean, so I mean, we don't have to go. down that path. But if you want to talk about oppression, we want to talk about a global kind of oppression on its own people. We should talk about, rhetorically, we should talk about that. But
Yeah.
that's for
Um,
another time for sure.
yeah, and I will say so on this note of like people just seeing things in binary ways and as a result saying and believing very foolish things. Um, Columbia University Apartheid Divest, CUAD, recently came out and said that the apology that they issued last year um, was, well, I'll read the New York Times headline. Well, they rescinded it basically. So this is the New York Times. Pro-Palestinian group at Columbia now backs, quote, armed resistance by Hamas. Columbia University Apartheid Divest has
Sorry.
withdrawn an apology it made last spring for a member who said, quote, Zionists don't deserve to live. That member was, as some of you might remember, I think it's Hamani. I always can't. I'm always struggle with the first name. James is his last name.
I've forgotten the name because my brain just
Um,
melted a little bit.
yeah, and he said things such as, "quote Zionists don't deserve to live." "Quote Be grateful that I'm not just going around. Excuse me. Be grateful that I am not just going out and murdering Zionists." Um, so yeah, he got in trouble for that for very understandable reasons. It's quite violent rhetoric.
So
And then
they took back the apology for him.
the CUAD took back their apology, and then James wrote in a statement on X. Um, actually, let me pull it up so I can quote it exactly. Let's see. Thank you to my comrades. Of course, he uses the term comrades for
Oh, we are
posting this
so there, aren't
beautiful.
we? We are so there.
Yeah. Thank you to my comrades for posting this beautiful, powerful letter. I never wrote the quote neoliberal. I don't know why I keep saying quote. Sorry. I never wrote the neoliberal apology posted it in late April. And I'm glad we've set the record straight once and for all. I will not allow anyone to shame me for my politics. Anything I said, I meant it. So I love that he describes the apology as neoliberal and that he uses the term comrades.
Oh
I
my
mean,
God,
he's
help us
ticking
all,
all the
please.
boxes. Um,
All the boxes. Yep.
so as you can imagine, again, we will include the link to everything that we're talking about, the tweet and this New York Times article, right? Um, but
Jeez.
I mean, just craziness, just craziness. I've made this point before. I will make it again. If you support quote armed resistance by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the PLO, um, any of these Palestinian organizations to literally start a war, Hezbollah, which is not Palestinian, it's Lebanese, just clear that
It's
up.
just the
But
fuel
any of
tank
these
for it.
groups in this region, right, surrounding Israel, to start a war with Israel, you are supporting an action that will get countless Palestinians killed.
Yes.
The current situation in Gaza, case in point,
Yep.
you know, how many tens of thousands? It's something like 40,000,
Yeah. Yep.
a large percentage of which, it needs to be said, are legitimate members of Hamas who I am not losing any sleep over, their deaths. But that still leaves tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians caught in the crossfire.
Mm-hmm.
Also worth noting, in large part because Hamas did not spend all of their money that they made over the last, decade or so building shelters for their people and in fact used them quite intentionally as human shields.
Yeah.
Right. But how
Mm-hmm.
many innocent Palestinians are being killed in crossfire? Tens of thousands. You claim to care about these people. You don't, because if you are supporting armed resistance, you are supporting an action that will get tens of thousands of more of them killed, period.
Mm-hmm.
It is completely foolish. You care more about, to your point, Anthony, some sort of broader anti-Western, anti-colonial um, movement for which the creation of a Palestinian state exclusively between the river and the sea is just one important part to you, but not the only part. And you are willing for tens of thousands of Palestinians, innocent Palestinians, to die to serve this goal, and you are also, it should be said, more than willing to allow hundreds of thousands, millions of Israelis to die, hypothetically, for this goal.
Yeah.
You're not that's not what a good person
No.
supports. That's just
No.
crazy. It's
No.
just crazy.
That was beautifully stated. I think I'm at a lo I mean, I don't know how many times I'm going to feel at a loss for words for this. I mean, even it doesn't matter how often I read the psychological literature and ideology or extremism. It just you can get into the books, you can get into the weeds, into the stats, into this, into that, into scholarship, but nothing ever it almost doesn't it doesn't have an it almost like my human side just can't grapple with this idea that you have students who literally feel they like this idea of long, what does it say over here? It says long live October 7th was tweeted by someone. Yeah, but within our lifetime, that's the other group. Yeah, that
That's
was the other
yeah.
group. Um and then the on October 7th on campus, I guess we can transition to the campus thing. Um you had students who, well, there was a barricade, right? They were pretty far away from each other, but you had the pro Hamas at this point students yelling and shouting, and you were there, and we talked about this a little bit
Mhm.
last week, I think, right? But um, generally speaking, do you think that we've reached an apex with campus
I
being
don't know.
ridiculous?
I
Okay,
On the last episode, I predicted that I was, well, I said that I was afraid that things might get out of hand. I'm happy to report I was wrong. Things didn't necessarily get out of hand in terms of violence, or no one got too crazy. Um, it was pretty weird and in poor taste to hold, I think, of the pro-Palestinian. I would prefer to call them anti-Israel protesters, because they're not pro-Palestinian. I think not really, at least not. They're as I've just made this point, right?
I'm
Like,
shameless. I
yeah,
called them pro Hamas.
well, yeah. The anti-Israel protesters, to hold that demonstration on October 7th was, I think, in very poor taste. But it didn't get out of hand, in
Well,
my
what do you
opinion.
expect? Yeah.
But I don't know, because on one hand, that demonstration did not get out of hand. That's a positive thing. On the other hand, COAD comes out with this craziness, not this nonsense. That's concerning. So I'm not going to make any predictions. I don't have a good track record with that, clearly. Um, but what I will say was that the showing of pro Israel students was inspiring, because they also did not get out of hand. They, unlike the anti Israeli crowd, showed their faces, faced the crowd, because there's like a line of kind of spectators along the main drag that goes through campus observing this. They faced the crowd. They were louder. Because they had a microphone, so they weren't drowned out by the anti-Israeli protesters. They made a better showing, I think, um, which
Yeah.
was also, gave me a little bit of comfort. Um,
What do we make of
but
this, Clay? Because look, I'm thinking as you're saying all this and as I'm thinking through it, you and I on, talking now, it's really hard to, well, I'll just say it straight out. Like our podcast, we want to have various perspectives, different people, different views, experiences, but it makes sense that if any person on the other end of this discussion would hear this and say, "Oh, just two white dudes," even though I'm a little ambiguous because people always think I'm from Iran. Actually, they do. They think I'm Middle Eastern. Um,
you do look like you do look Middle Eastern. You
yeah,
have the skin
Southern
tone and the
Italian.
facial hair.
We definitely have, right. Yeah, phenotypically, I'm
Well,
definitely,
your family's from Southern Italy, right?
yeah, yeah,
Lot of Middle Eastern,
yeah.
North African admixture made it up
Moors,
there
yeah.
for the Moorish pirates and all that kind. There's a
Mhm.
lot of cool history with
There,
that. So you
it
probably do have a lot of Middle Eastern ancestry, I bet.
probably,
Yeah.
probably. I would not, I would not be surprised. But nonetheless, I'm considered white.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, two white dudes talking about how Israel showed up really, elegantly, and how the other side was just. And I'm not saying anything about your expression of which you saw because I agree with you. But here I am. I also don't see how. I think it would be cool to have somebody on the other side of this discussion
Oh, I'd love
come
that.
talk to
I
us.
would love
But
that.
there's a part of me that's just like goes back to what we were saying about the binary thinking and the flawed premises that just lead to a very vile conclusion that it's that. But I'm not against talking to somebody about that. it's just it would be an exercise for me because it would be really hard to it'd be really hard. I'm not gonna lie. It'd be really hard. But I'd be up for it. I'd be up for it. I think we
Mm.
should. But
That
what do you
almost
feel
certainly
about
will
that?
not happen because I guarantee like 99% chance we just can't get someone to come on. I would love it as well. Have you ever tried to talk to these people? It's oh, I'm not the media person.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't really want to comment. Oh, we don't talk to me. It's just no one will do. I mean, maybe I hope I'm wrong about that. I'd love to have
And
someone
I
on.
want to,
I wouldn't
yeah,
hold your
because
breath.
no, and when you're talking about somebody on the other end of it, who would come on, it would be somebody who probably would start to get into the nitty-gritty of the nuance that you're talking
Mhm,
about, like
mhm,
about, well, there are these problems, back in 2005 with the, Israel putting up, I don't know what was when they came out of the West Bank, um, and just creating a vacuum with it. You could talk about the geopolitical stuff and the all the important stuff that we would like to talk about, and that yeah, this makes sense if these are people who are oppressed. And but what I'm talking about is actually a person who really believes that this oppressed oppressor dynamic. That would
mhm.
be an interesting discussion, but I don't know how fruitful that would be. um so here I am sitting thinking, like, we're talking about this conflict, and we're running this group that focuses on heterodoxy, and which is the sort of flexible thinking, not rigidity, and not orthodox, obviously. um but I find myself having a hard time getting to that point,
Yeah,
sometimes. I'm not
yeah,
gonna lie.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's tough.
it is tough.
Um, but
So
I will say, like, vibes on campus have been. I guess here's the thing. It's hard for me to gauge. Like for me, vibes even during the height of the protests, I was like, so at the Free Press after party, I got the chance to go up to Jesse Single, be like, "Hey, I'm the guy you guys quoted on the podcast about with on your episode about the Columbia um, protests," and I still maintain the same thing the quote that I gave them is up until the Hamilton Hall thing.
yeah,
It was pretty easy to ignore those protests. I would go
yeah,
in, go to class, minor inconvenience of having to scan in. That was about it. Not that big of a deal. I was fine. I was totally fine. But for Jewish students, and as I have come to learn somewhat recently, for veterans who, unlike myself, saw combat, it was an emotionally difficult time. Just the symbolism that they were seeing in those protests and the rhetoric, which again makes sense for Jewish students. Maybe you all have not thought about this other group, which is veterans who saw combat. I underestimated the degree to which it would affect them initially,
um,
but it did, and I know because I've talked to several of them. Um, so in terms of like what campus is like, I think if you're not one of those two groups, it's pretty easy to ignore. I think, for some people, this is very an emotional issue,
oh,
and
for
so
sure. Yeah.
it's for some people, it's very very difficult.
Oh, without question. Without question. It's, I mean,
But for
yeah,
like someone like me, those protesters don't scare me, dude.
they annoy me.
They annoy me mildly, but they're relatively easy to ignore. And if God forbid they ever got violent, I don't know if you've seen that crowd, but I feel like I could take most of them.
I
I'm not too worried about it. It's
I
a lot of rich kids, you know.
I think you're right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I still think it would be yeah, I'm toying with this idea, man. I don't know. It'd be interesting to go up to one of the protesters and actually engage in a discussion and just ask them questions. I'm
They
reluctant
probably
though.
won't do it, but I agree with you. It would be really great.
Maybe we should try. I don't know.
You should try. You
Have you
should try.
tried or no?
I've tried a few times early on in the protest, like when they first started. I talked to a couple people, had some really interesting conversations.
Okay.
Um, like just like walked onto the field with my friend PJ
Uh-huh.
during one of the demonstrations, just talked to a young woman who had family over there. And like, listen, I think you and I are broadly quite sympathetic to the
It
Israeli
goes to
people.
your point earlier.
Yeah. But um, there are, and the other group for whom this is really hard is people who are emotionally connected to Palestine and
Yeah.
that idea and that identity. And that's worth talking about too, because we talk a lot about Hamas and all of the weirdos in this like CUAD and all that, and this like anti-Israeli movement. But there are a lot of
Yeah.
people who probably just would kill for a ceasefire.
Well,
Maybe poor choice of
that
words.
was an
Poor
interesting
choice
use
of
of
words on
word.
my part. I did not do that on purpose. But would give anything for a ceasefire, just
By
because
any
they
means
know
necessary.
people, because they know they just want the fighting to be over, and they probably hate Hamas because they started a war with Israel, and they understand what that means. And they are more connected to actual Palestinian lives than they are to the idea of Palestine from the river to the sea,
Sure,
right?
it's yeah, it's your group affiliation too. I
Yeah.
mean, by
And those
default.
people we should have a lot of empathy and sympathy for, because I
Yeah.
feel like they are getting their voices are not being heard, because they're drowned out by the lunatics.
Well,
And
it's just like the race issue here in
yeah,
America, where you have tons of black scholars and middle class to low income black Americans who are drowned out. Their voices are drowned
yeah,
out because you have the elite. And this is a good segue to Musa's book, actually.
yes.
Um,
Which
where
which going it is I okay, admittedly I've only read the introduction because I have no time
oh, I
and I'm
should have
trying to get
gotten
through it.
mine. Yeah,
But based on the talk that we saw, what was it? It was yesterday. Or
it
was it?
was
It was
yesterday.
yesterday. Yeah.
If any,
Um,
yeah, 10, 11, October 11, 2024.
yes. Musa gave a talk at the Liberty, to a small group of people, and it was so interesting. He did a book reading. This is going to be, I can already tell from the introduction, an
Um,
absolute banger. I mean,
yeah,
just a fascinating book.
yeah, I think so
Um,
too. He says a lot of things that are not being said.
yes. And
Yeah.
this is a guy who, I mean, he had worked on this for years. I think he's been working on this for many, many years.
Mm,
So this is the product of years of obsessive study,
yeah.
from what I can tell on his part. So go out and get yourself a copy. It's called "We Have Never Been Woke" by Musa Al Garbi. We should also mention he will be coming to Columbia on November 7th to give a talk
Yeah. Yeah.
to all of
Um, we'll
us.
have to figure out live streaming for that. That's not a promise. We just that might be something up in the air.
Yeah,
But of course, listeners, if you're part of the Columbia HXA community, so you're obviously automatically welcome to come to this event because it's we don't know what the situation is going to be for campus access. So
yeah.
you're definitely invited. But so yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, it's the same dynamic of like I was saying, Black Americans who are often drowned out by the elite as Musa well, I'm not quoting Musa, but it's the idea of the social capitalist of
Hmm.
those who hold sort of the I don't even know how to properly define it, so I'm just going to stop there, but it's in short, it's not your everyday workers, the people who
Yes.
are making, who are driving productivity. That's probably not the right way of saying it too. Who are making the products, who are doing things for us. That's what I meant. Because you drive productivity in different ways too. But um, you know, scholars, the ivory tower is a big example of social capitalist. I think I've always been one. Come to think of it, as a musician, though arguably I think lots of indie musicians or musicians who are trying to make it might not be, but I
Well, I
grew up in
think
a classical music, which is very much so social capitalist. Very
you think
much
so.
so.
Well, I mean, you're the music, the kind of thing you just got back. Was it today or yesterday from playing a wedding, right?
Yeah, it
So
was a
you're that's a little bit that crosses into almost a vocation, right? Because that's like a solid like a thing, like actually literally like a manual labor thing in a sense, because you are actually using your hands and voice, or I think hands
you
because you
know
play the
that's
organ, right?
yeah,
So maybe not so much, right? Like
that's a good point. What
you're
I mean
playing
to say
weddings and churches and stuff, you're providing a concrete service.
that's a very good point. Perhaps I'm not fleshing it out as well. I mean, the profession that I was going into, certainly, what you just said, yes, I agree. I think there's a difference between social capitalists and that, but the direction that I was headed toward was very much so in the social capitalist. It's like you at a university teaching, organ, teaching scholarly uh, s- studies on manuscripts and then touring the world, playing concerts, and just I mean
Mhm.
that's a life of that's a true that is truly social capitalism. But yeah, not to get off guard too much. I mean off track too much, but
Don't
uh
let your guard down.
don't let me go right. Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah. But I think I think that that what I was saying about the connection between the Black community and this issue with the sympathy that college students feel towards Palestinians, it converges onto the virtue signaling territory, and I think there's that luxury the more you're in the academy. I mean, you feel like you have the sort of permission to say anything you want. I don't know. You want to elaborate on that or the idea of the social capitalist or whatever?
Well, I still need to read the book.
Yeah.
Everything I know about the book is from the introduction and from listening to Musa on a number of podcasts, and then obviously last night he did a reading. Um, but the sense I get, like the basic outline of his idea, right, is that like the social capitalist wants to support all of these good causes, but doesn't want to actually give anything up. So he gives the example of like I think this is in the introduction. Maybe I'm getting it from one of his talks. I'm blanking out, but like, like people marching for BLM and like walking past Black and Hispanic and minority homeless people, right? And not taking the time to be like to like go buy them food or like shoes or something. It's like support is immaterial, because if it was material, you'd have to maybe give something up. Um, the social capitalist, is like you're saying. This is why I was pushing back against your museum thing. It's a museum. I'm sorry, your music thing. I don't know
I was
your music thing. Is because like playing an instrument is like you do it with your body. I mean, I've got my guitars right back here. It's a skill. It's a trade in a sense. But like he made the point in his talk last night. If you took all of the sort of like there's a class of people that's like an intellectual class, a group of people who works with all it's all brain stuff. It's all writing and blah 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 blah. But like he made the point last night, if you looked at like 80 to 85%, it was something like that, of all published works and like papers, none of them get cited. Or like
right.
none of that 80% will have ever been cited at all. Um 70% of the time it works every time. No, 80% of these papers never get cited. And then if you don't count people citing their own work, that number goes up. Right. So it's like a
Right.
tiny fraction of papers that actually get cited by other academics and are, I guess, in any way useful. Ergo, all of these don't really do anything because no one uses them. Um, or like he gives the other example of well, I'll stop there. But like that gives you an idea of like these symbolic capitalists kind of trade in symbolism. They trade in rhetoric and platitudes and are just like so immaterial. Oh yeah, I will say the other example he gave was like if like 90% of academics or like 90% of all the academic work that is being done and has been done just like went away, almost nothing would change. Basically nothing would
Oh
change.
yeah.
But if hypothetically you like 90% of truck drivers stop of the truck driving work or the mechanic or
Goods and
plumbing
services, people
work,
who do all these,
yeah,
yeah,
just like vanished for like a day, our society would
would be
collapse,
screwed.
right?
Yeah.
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 Um, so symbolic capitalism, like all of these things play into his idea of symbolic capitalism. We're not doing a good idea of defining it, but I still actually need to read the book. um,
Well, I mean, um, I think it's a pretty generally good, at least grasp on it because we were there, and um,
mhm.
those that excerpt that he read was quite it was quite something about the about I have to I think this is a good moment to say that so to everyone listening, I've been dealing with cue the music therapy session, dim the lights. No. I've been battling internally this sort of do I after Columbia, do I go on to a PhD program,
Yes.
and
Hmm.
I just I don't know. I joked last night. I said to Musa, I said, well, you've sealed the deal for me. I'm definitely not getting a PhD because it's like I always have this sense that it's 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 a feeling that just kind of pervades. Um, that not only do I not want to spend another 7 years in school, really, um, but I'm not really that excited about the way the research enterprise in psychology, clinical psychology especially, is set up. It's a lot of the same stuff circulating. It's like airplane air, with a lot of really bad assumptions that continuously get published and sort of somebody has a positive finding in a study, and maybe the method, and often the methodology is not really that great. And then somebody comes along and does it again and gets a positive finding, and it's just one bias plus another bias doesn't equal truth. It just equals more bias. So you have, not only is the academy is psychology 17 to 1 liberal to conservative. Um, well, that number could be off at this point, but I think that's the number in one of in was it Lee Jussum? I could be wrong, but Haidt or Jonathan Haidt or Lee Jussum, one of these two. Justin is a social psychology professor at Rutgers University, by the way. But anyway, the point is, and he's really big on the idea of embedded values in social psych, not only social psychology, but generally in research and in well, in psychology research, that investigators, researchers come to the table with embedded values, with their presuppositions already, laid out as if they already had the conclusion. I mean, to some degree, that is research. You go in with the excitement of your question, and you really think this is something that's happening in the world, and you want to test it. But it turns out that a lot of that leads to really biased measuring. And I just
Mhm.
found an article today, actually, from Communication Psychology. Here's the title: Liberal conservative asymmetries in anti democratic tendencies are partly explained by psychological differences in nationally representative US sample. That's the title. And so they're looking for asymmetries in um, anti democratic tendencies, but the measures they use are asymmetric. The measures they
Mhm.
use
Mhm.
are, they don't test anything in the liberal domain, they test all the things that are assumed to point to
A conservative.
how, yes, like the
Yeah.
right wing
You know,
authoritarianism measure,
this is
social dominance orientation.
this
Yeah.
is great. Musa has himself has spoken on this point a little bit in some talks I've seen him do online. I'll see if I can find them and post them in the show notes actually, because that would be that he makes a similar because he makes this argument. I'm gonna struggle to remember this, but the basic thing is like he shows a graph about how liberals have like kind of gone more left and right wingers have gotten a little bit more right wing, but
Hmm.
left wingers have gotten even more left than the right wingers have gone right. And the graph is labeled like is like why are right wingers going so far right? And he's like they haven't gone as far right as the left wing people have gone left, and they are showing the graph that proves this.
Yeah.
So it reminded me of that. I'll include it in the show. See if I can find it, include it in the
And
show
it
notes.
probably has a connection to, and it raises an empirical question
Right.
as to whether or not this effect can be traced, or connects to or correlates with what our few guests ago, the two um, wonderful professors we had on our show, about respect and
Oh,
loathing in America, like that there's a higher tendency for liberals to moralize certain issues. And well, maybe, yeah, there it is. Maybe
yeah.
that's not actually
It's
the
Jeff Spinner
objective,
Halev and Elizabeth Thies Morse.
right? And it's, and without going into that,
Respect and
there's
loathing in American democracy.
right, their thesis too much, it's really showing a huge effect on how liberals tend to have lower a certain respect. You have civic respect, and then you have recognition respect, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And recognition respect is just recognizing you as a sentient human being who
Mm-hmm.
deserves to be
With
respected.
humanity.
Yeah. And liberals show much higher levels, much lower levels of that kind of respect at a higher rate.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so anyway, okay, the point being is really to close my little therapy session is that I don't know if I want to jump into the academy. In Life is so short that I know that's a platitude and people say it all the time, but I almost want to hop on the initiatives that are looking at so much of the bias in research and doing
Yeah.
independent research. And I kind of think that's where I want to be, you know. And
Yeah.
what do you what do you feel about, you'd mentioned
Oh,
PhDs.
I'm not
You're like a
doing, no, no. I want to work. I'm like almost 30. I want to like start a career. I might
yeah.
come back for, depending on what I do, I might come back for a master's later, but I don't want to do it right now. I'd like to make just a little more money than I do right
Yeah, I
now, which
just
is would not be hard to do. I guess it's starting
yes.
pretty low. Um, so no, I'm not interested in
It's also the culture though sometimes does it just doesn't, it's nothing, no animosity towards it. It's just it doesn't always match up with who I feel like who I am as a, you know, I just I don't always enjoy academia. Like the
yeah.
I'm probably going to what is it called? Spite
It's not always
myself. I don't
spite.
know if I can.
Um, I wanted to briefly um read. I actually remembered. Oh wait, he defines Musa Al-Gharbi defines symbolic capitalists
Oh,
in
good, good.
Foucault.
So we
So
could,
I'm going to go
yeah,
ahead and read this.
please.
I'll read this part. Let's see. In sociological terms, a capitalist is not someone who simply favors capitalism, but rather someone who possesses financial resources, capital, that are used to acquire, exert control over, and extract profits from the means of material production. Drawing on Pierre Bourdieu, we can define a symbolic capitalist as someone who possesses a high level of symbolic capital and exerts control over and extracts profits from the means of symbolic production. If that sounds okay, so yeah, that is the definition. And I'm just realizing I think he also has a maybe another definition in there, but that is the one he offers. One of the definitions he offers um, in the intro. So you get a sense of the fact that the symbolic capitalist deals in the immaterial as opposed to the capitalist, if
Like
that makes sense.
abstract, like you have this
Yeah.
whole um research program on microaggressions, which are,
Mhm.
please don't, we won't, we'll have to have somebody who specializes in debunking that on the
Yeah, because
show,
it's just
because that is just that might, if you want my head to explode. But anyway, so somebody like that, like who disseminates, you know, who has information spreading throughout the culture, and um it lands on the, you know, it does, that kind of stuff does end up in society at large though, to some degree, at least implicitly, you know, people do absorb it, some of it. It doesn't just stay within the university itself. It doesn't only stay there. I mean, you have things like the social stuff definitely does leak out a bit, but yeah, it's so it's knowledge creation,
yeah.
rather than, yeah,
Which,
it's
as we
abstract.
covered, like a lot of the so-called knowledge production, it like actually doesn't go anywhere and doesn't do anything, and is like extremely superfluous.
But that's
Uh,
funny though, you know, because that's a postmodern argument. And I'm not saying that I'm not saying that on the negative. That's a Foucaultian sort, if that's how you say
well,
it.
I mean, I not quite right because Foucault would like broad. I mean, I'm not an expert, but like broadly argue against objective truth, whereas this is just like there are
No,
some.
he was knowledge. His whole thing was the knowledge enterprise, like arbiters of knowledge, production,
Right.
um, were essentially, um, well, of course, a straight white male being the arbiter of knowledge
Mhm.
in the academy. And though, funny enough, he was part of that whole enterprise. Well, he was not straight, but I don't mean to cut you off, but his idea
Fine.
was that power that harnessed in knowledge production is the need for power, is the
Right.
propagation of power. Yeah.
Right. 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 Right.
So that's, yeah,
That's actually an interesting point. All
yeah.
right. Well, we've been going for I think over an hour.
Really?
So
Okay, we thought we
yeah.
were going to be.
Do you want to? We might be. I maybe around an hour, maybe a little over. Do you want to call it and then we
Yeah.
can hopefully have a guest. We have a couple guests we're looking into for next week, so hopefully we'll get someone on. They're both really interesting, so either one will be good. Thank you guys for listening,
Yeah. Thank you
and
for that.
we will see you in the next one.
Sounds good.
Go buy a copy of Moose's book.